I request all panelists to keep yourself on mute so that we can listen. So hello and good afternoon from Islamabad to all of the panelists to this webinar. I can imagine somebody had to get up in the middle of night and some early in the morning, and some had other engagements, but you joined us. It's very prestigious for us. We are very much honored that we have such galaxy of speakers. This webinar, as you know, is organized as a parallel event on the sidelines of the 48th session of United Nations Human Rights Council. The theme for today's webinar is UN Special Procedure Communications and State Response. As you know, all of you are very familiar with the UN systems, and you know all that that these special procedures constitute a very important system of body of the UN human rights mechanisms. What is their duty? What they do? As we all know, that they are not the employees of the UN. They are the experts. They give their expert opinions. They provide the expert and capacity building to the states in improving their human rights, and also they are responsible for the development of international human rights standards, advocacy, awareness, and also present thematic and country-specific reports to the Human Rights Council. Besides this, they also report on the specific issues of human rights violations to the countries concerned, and it's the responsibility of concerned countries to respond to the queries of the special procedures. Why we chose this topic is that since August 5th, 2019, we have seen a series of communications by the special rapporteurs jointly and individually to the government of India regarding the host of human rights violations which they committed during this period, not only during this period, even before that. But we have seen that Indian response before, how India is responding to the human rights systems, human rights machinery, be that the early reports by the special rapporteurs or the two reports of the Office of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Jammu and Kashmir. And we thought that we should have the learned opinion from our learned scholars on these issues and other issues pertaining to this. What are the ways and means for the people, the victims of human rights violations? On one way, when they use the special procedures, they feel reprisals in their own countries, and on the other hand, the special procedures, communications don't have any impact on their countries concerned. So with this, I now introduce the panel of speakers. I have with me Dr. Syed Nazir Gilani. Dr. Syed Nazir Gilani is a British Kashmiri from Baramulla town of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, one of the 40 people around the world chosen under the UN and EU program of 1960 to specialize in peacekeeping, humanitarian operations, election monitoring mission from the University of Pisa, Italy. Dr. Gilani was elected at the United Nations World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna to present the unpresent peoples and nations of the world. He has remained a member of the International Platform of Jurists for East Timor until the independence of East Timor. He worked on the jurisprudence of UN Tablet on Kashmir, advocates the rights and dignity and security and self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. He is president of JKCHR, an NGO in special consultative status with the UN. I have with me Dr. Iqtidar Chima is member of United Nations Global Steering Committee, Director of HEI Human Rights Defender. Dr. Chima was the first author on the minorities of India, the minority issues of India. This report was adopted by the US Senate Committee also. We have with us Barrister Tanveer Munib. He is a counsel of the International Criminal Court, barrister of the Lincoln's Inn, UK, advocate of Supreme Court in Bangladesh, a very good friend of ours. Robert Patana, if I spell correctly, is an author and a journalist working for peace and social justice. Robert's book will be available in early 2022. It is Settler Colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. He is currently studying PhD in sociology. His area of research concerns the impact of Palestinians of the Israeli blockade of Gaza Strip. Robert is a US citizen and has moved to Canada. We have with us Mary Sikuri, is a social activist. She frequently writes on war and human rights issues and is a good voice for Kashmiris in the United States. I have with me Ms. Julie Ward, a former MEP and a very noble advocate of people of Kashmir, especially in the EU Parliament. And also whenever we ask her to come, she is readily available for webinar or in a physical presence. I have with me Mr. Parvez Ahmad Shah. Parvez Ahmad Shah also is from Indian occupied Kashmir, currently in Islamabad. He is the former Secretary General of the All Parties Hurriyat Conference. I've been joined by also Professor Dr. Shagufta Ashraf. He is a member of, faculty member of University of Kotli and also a human rights defender and coordinates the webinars for the UN Human Rights Council for our institute. So thank you, gentlemen. I will straight away go to Dr. Gilani for his wisdom on the topic of what he has to say. We will like to listen from Dr. Gilani first. Dr. Gilani, you have the floor.
Good afternoon from London. At the outset, I would like to express my profound felicitations and thankfulness to your institute, Kashmir Institute of International Relations and World Muslim Congress, to organize this side event at the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. And it gives me added pleasure to see Advocate Parvez Shah from Indian occupied Kashmir and yourself. And we are three, I think, who represent the side which is very much hot and the principal point of discussion today. The United Nations regime of human rights, I think it hinges on these experts. It hinges on these special rapporteurs, independent experts, and working groups. It gained momentum, I think, in 1967, when we had the first working group on human rights situation in Southern Africa. Then it came Chile in 75, was the working group. Then 79, they had the expert. Then in 80, they had the first thematic mandate. But at this point, we have around 44 mandates, thematic, and 11 country experts. The human rights mechanism obliges countries, because since the Human Rights Council is a creation of General Assembly, so Article 2 of the UN Charter obligates all the member nations to cooperate with the United Nations mechanism on human rights, the system which exists. And any country that wants to run away, because even the Americans could not run away from it, because they had an investigation, a report in 2017 on human rights and poverty and immigration in the United States of America. We here in Britain had an investigation by the UN expert in 2018 on human rights and the poverty. And there were two very scathing reports. They came down heavily on the Britain that one of the fifth or one of the five leading economies of the world has pockets of immense poverty, that they have sold the parks, they have sold the facilities, and it was a very, very serious criticism of the social inequity and inequality in the United Kingdom at that point. As far as the government of India is concerned, I think they were a subject of a request by around 19 experts in 2020, asking India to explain certain areas, because a rapporteur or an investigator investigates, reports, and advises. And from there we build the mechanism of human rights. The special communications save lives. They are very important around the world. This mechanism has been used again and again. So unfortunately, India has put up its back onto the United Nations Human Rights Council and the requests made by these special rapporteurs so far. But there's one very important point, that there might come a time when India might lose itself in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, and in the Human Rights Council altogether. It would be a nullity. It would zero itself, because if it does not discharge the obligations on Article 2 of the UN Charter, it wants to remain in the General Assembly, it wants to remain in the Security Council and in the Human Rights Council. At the same time, violates the requests of the system, which is the principal element of the UN Charter. The member nations have an obligation under the Charter. I think most of you would know that in 2005, Israel made a request to the United Nations to expel Iran from the General Assembly, from the United Nations, for its violation of the principles of the UN Charter. So there would come in aggregate a time, if not today, if not tomorrow, day after and day after, then someone among us ourselves would build up a case that should we request an expulsion of India under Article 6 of the UN Charter? This should be remembered very well, because India cannot go scot-free, because United Nations system is not so loose that you would wish to have a seat in the Security Council for 2 years, would want to have a seat in the Human Rights Council, you would want to be a member of the General Assembly, but at the same time you would wish to nudge past the request or ignore the request of 19 experts of the Human Rights Council. So this is a very serious situation. It might build up to a point when we might ask a member country or a friendly country to make out a case on behalf of the people of Kashmir that India does not qualify under Article 6 to remain a member. In the same manner in which Israel made a request in 2005 that Iran should be expelled. But Israel did not have a case in aggregate as strong as the people of Kashmir have, or as the United Nations itself has against the government of India or the Indian state as a member of the United Nations General Assembly. So if the government of India does not want to open up to the UN system, which asks for transparency, for a proper reporting on the situation of the human rights situation in the Indian occupied Kashmir, the two reports by the High Commissioner for Human Rights of 2018 and 2019 are documents, are a Bible of the violation of human rights committed by India in the Indian occupied Kashmir, and all the recommendations stand as a debt against the government of India. They have to discharge the requests made in those two reports, and India has not come up. India has failed to respond to those two reports as well. And then there are reports from your NGO, from other people who are on the panel who work on the situation of human rights in Indian occupied Kashmir. And as you have very rightly said in the beginning, that after 5th of August, we have a situation. So India has committed um, an offense against the UN security resolutions because it has violated all those resolutions, in particular of 30th of March 1951, and gone against. The government of India does not have any authority. It has assumed an authority to take action in the Indian occupied part of Kashmir, which it cannot. So we have a serious human rights situation over there. We have I think, all the mandates of the Human Rights Council have been alerted, and everyone is concerned because India has barricaded a vast population of Kashmiris who live on the Indian side of ceasefire line from rest of the world. So we need to know what is happening to people over there. So these communications which have been sent by the experts, special rapporteurs, are very, very important. And the requests are part of the UN mechanism, and India has to discharge all those obligations that flow or stem from any body of the UN, and Human Rights Council is one of the lead bodies at this point. And all these special rapporteurs, experts, and working groups are very important. In particular, the working group has taken up the issue that India has profiled the youth of Kashmir into 5 categories to kill them. So killing a youth under each category carries a reward. So this is India has created mercenaries legally to take out of circulation the living youth of Kashmir. So this is a question of the working group. This is a question of the independent experts. This is a question of special rapporteurs. I would conclude with one thing to sensitize the interest of the panelists, that in 1995, the Rashtriya Rifles arrested my father, my uncle, 2 uncles, and my brother. If it would not have been the special rapporteur of the human rights, Roger Rodney, if he had not made a special and urgent communication to the government of India and to the rest of the world, all these 3 people would have been killed under detention. So special communications or urgent actions conducted or taken by these rapporteurs are as important as life-saving drugs like penicillin are in medical profession. With that, I would say that we should today agree that if India continues with its objection or with its non-cooperation with the UN system, do we need to make a case under Article 6 and seek for the expulsion of the government of India, though it may be a very uphill task, but there is no harm in making an effort and making it clear to the rest of the world that if the nations violate the international norms, they have to pay a price for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gilani, for your very knowledgeable input. Really, we need to work on it and see how it goes. And though it's, as you said, a very uphill task, but we will have to do something innovative in order to bring the India to the terms of the United Nations human rights mechanism, so that they should respect that human rights systems. My next speaker will be Dr. Iqtidar Chima, as I have been asked that he has some other appointment. Dr. Saab, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Wani Saab, and rest of the participants. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are based. It's always been delightful to work with you and the World Muslim Council. on human rights issues. I would like to be very, very specific because obviously there are wider issues and there are so many which we may have discussed. But just for the panelists as well as the people who are listening to us today, I would like to clarify very briefly. You have already done a very good job at clarifying about these special communications. And I would specifically would like to emphasize the communications which are part of the report of the 48th session of Human Rights Council, because it is very pertinent to mention specifically in the context of Kashmir in India, what cases are being discussed or have constituted the report for 48th session. So as you elaborated, these communications are later sent by special procedures to governments and others, such as intergovernmental organization, businesses, military and security companies. So it is not, these special procedures does not apply to member states only. The scope is wider. It could be sent to organizations, military and security personnel and establishments as well. So these special communication from the UN expert conveys the allegation of human rights violation they have received regarding past human rights violation, which can be an object to letter of allegation, ongoing or potential human rights violation, as well as some urgent appeals, as Professor Nazir has pointed out. So these are the purposes of these communications. Basically, these communications are to draw the attentions of the government and others on alleged human rights violation, as the violations are prevented, stopped, investigated, and remedial actions are taken. And obviously, UN Human Rights Council expect these communications to receive some replies, but sometimes the governments, they do not reply, or organization, they want to stick to the impunity and they do not reply. But obviously the outcome is that it raises a wider public awareness on individual group cases, on legislation, policy development, and this has been a wonderful procedures to in terms of creating awareness and impacting the legislation and policies. If you look at the specifics, if you look at the specifics of 48th session specifically, as Professor Nazir Gilani was saying, it wasn't only in the past. I was really surprised to see a lot of correspondence is not related to third world or South Asia alone. In the current session, the countries like US, UK, France, Spain, I mean, these are the countries which talks very proudly or portray themselves very proudly as the human rights defenders. They are being scrutinized as well. There is a lot of correspondence related to these countries, as well as some of the member states who heavily contribute financially to UN Human Rights Council, i.e. Saudi Arabia, countries like UAE, countries like Morocco, and there are so many which are being scrutinized in the 48th session. But I would like to curtail my reflection specifically on the state of India. So as the colleagues were mentioning, India has quite wide range of special procedure correspondence recently. Some of it obviously is related to India, which is a cause of concern for Human Rights Council as well as for the rest of the UN structure. But there are wider issues as well when it comes to the restrictions or blackouts on social media, as well as even blocking the internet facility. The issues related to Dalits, issues related to women status in India, issues related to the farming communities, and the million of farmers in India has been protesting over a year now, as well as human rights defenders, their extrajudicial killing, as well as arbitrary execution and detentions. So I would quickly summarize what is being brought to the attention of this 48th session. I would first like to elaborate a bit about Kashmir specific issues which are being discussed or have been brought to the attention of Human Rights Council 47th and 48th session. I think the major one is obviously the arrest and death of Mr. Muhammad Ashraf Khan Sehrai. We have been consistently voicing while he was detained. He was quite elderly. He was having chronic kidney disease, and obviously he had no access to adequate medication while he was arrested. And also his sons, Mujahid Ashraf Khan and Rashid Ashraf Khan, were also arrested after his funeral. So that has been flagged up with the Indian government by the mandate on the special rapporteur on extrajudicial arbitrary execution. Government of India has yet to respond, as well as previously the cases of Mr. Wahid Para, Mr. Irfan Ahmad Dar, Mr. Nasir Ahmad Wani. Obviously, these are the cases of arbitrary detention and extrajudicial killing, again, enforced disappearance, torture, and ill treatment committed against them. As you know, that Mr. Nasir Ahmad Wani is under consideration of the working group on enforced and involuntary disappearance and remains outstanding under its humanitarian individual case procedure. And obviously that very case of Mr. Nasir Ahmad Wani was submitted to Government of India on 8th of June 2020. So other than that, as we know that there have been strong restrictions on on coverage of journalists, the journalists who were covering the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and a lot of them have been penalized and have been subject to detentions, including Mr. Fahad Shah, who is a journalist and editor of Kashmir Wala, Aqib Javed, who was a journalist based in Srinagar, Mr. Sajar Gul, Qazi Shibli, and obviously Kashmir Times was yet another issue. That has been flagged up again with the Government of India very recently by the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of Right of Freedom of Opinion and Expression and the Working Group on the Arbitrary Detention. So you can see that people often criticize UN for not effectively flagging up things. But when it comes to Kashmir, it's not the case. We have 43-page report by the Office of UN Human Rights Commissioner released on July 8th, 2019, which raises serious concerns about the abuses of state security forces and armed groups in India, as well as but when we look at the response of the Indian government, we have clearly seen that the Government of India has dismissed the report and flagged it as false or motivated narrative. Now, Government of India can say that it is a motivated narrative or a false narrative, but by whom? Who has falsified it? These are the reports not by any particular country which might have rivalry with India, but these are the reports by the UN experts. And I think at least world has, we have issues about UN structure, but at least people still believe that UN structure does not get easily influenced by any rival countries of any other country, specifically the countries in South Asia. But more than that, what I would like to bring to the attention of the leadership here, that often when we talk about the human rights or we talk about the human rights of a particular community, we don't look at the wider picture. So what Kashmiri leadership specifically needs to look at is to look at the wider picture of what's happening in India and how international community is responding to that, and voice for others as well as their own concerns. If we will keep on working in isolation and wouldn't talk about others, then nobody would support your cause as well. Just in this session, there is another very important matter being reviewed, which is about the forming community of India, coming from specifically, it started from Punjab and then it went to Haryana, and we have quite a long, it is claimed that it is one of the longest peaceful protests in Indian history, which is ongoing for the last 1 year. Obviously, quite a few UN rapporteurs, not 1, 3, 4, 5 of them, has written to Government of India about this ongoing protest of farmers around New Delhi and area. Now, the response of Government of India, which we have received, portrays a very, very glorious picture that all these reforms or so-called 3 acts they passed in haste were quite for the communities and the farming communities, as well as it has not given the accurate details. When we talk about the ill responses of a very state, this very response of the government of India is a very true reflection of that. When it comes to Kashmir or human rights violation there, India often do not provide a response, or if it provides a response, it want it to be completely confidential so that it doesn't bring to the attention of the international community. But I was specifically looking at the response of government of India provided in terms of the farmers' protest, where it says it shows a very great picture that it was all done for the farmers' welfare, where it says that they really engaged with the farmers, they allowed their peaceful protest, and it looks that government of India is following all international norms when it comes to the farmers. Now, looking at the situation on the ground, it would be very, very different. Now, these farmers have faced the water cannons. These are the farmers from the age of 12 to 85. A lot of people have lost their life, and they have faced a lot of state persecution, arbitrary detention, and some of them has even faced the anti-terror laws. Now, anti-terror laws are also a cause of concern in the current session because there are quite a few human rights defenders who have been against whom the government of India has used these anti-terror laws in a very, very strange manner. We have a case of Miss Hidme Markham from Chhattisgarh, from India, who is a human rights defender. And the poor woman, a few of them on International Women's Day, they were protesting for her release and arbitrary detention. All of them have been taken in for under the anti-terror laws. Yet, Human Rights Council has to write to Government of India asking that that is clearly the violation of Article 9, subsection 4 on International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And similar are the cases of the Dalit communities. So my purpose to bring all to your attention is this: Kashmir is not the only issue India has been violating the human rights on or religious freedom about. If colleagues, few of you are aware that in 2017, the Trump administration adopted, actually I was contracted under the Obama administration to write a report on the constitutional legal challenges faced by the minorities in India, which was published under the Trump administration in 2017, rejected by the Indian Foreign Office. But obviously it has wider implications later. So in a nutshell, I would like to suggest few things for our leadership here to consider. One thing is this: all these reports, all these correspondence is very much there for your consumption. Now, when we talk about UN, people will often say that UN is a structure which doesn't pay attention. UN is a structure which is teethless. UN is a structure which probably is no more relevant. But I think what we forget, UN is not the name of an international army or international military. It's a platform of the nations. So any interested nations, and it doesn't represent people, it represents nations and the member states. So all of you are working for certain causes, needs to lobby very, very strongly with the nations who are willing to work on it. I have seen a dossier specifically on Kashmir very, very recently, coming from state of Pakistan and state of Azad Jammu and Kashmir. But I was quite surprised to see that within that dossier, we have not found any of these special rapporteur reports. If these reports were included in that, it would have added more authentic voice to your dossier, and it would have been probably more helpful. So there needs to be more work done. As I said earlier, you need to voice with others, because a lot of communities which are facing persecution, human rights violation, and violation of their international religious freedom, they do not work with each other. So all of these oppressed, marginalized people need to work together in the region as well as outside. So the more you do it, the more it's helpful. And most importantly, I just want to give my own experience. I mean, Government of India is so close to international community, and it wants it to be an Asian tiger, wants to be world merging economy. It's not going to happen. I remember, because I'm on the UN Global Steering Committee for the last 7 years, I've seen a lot of amazing things as well as some of the worst things. We wanted to have 2 of our consultations in New Delhi. The UN Under Secretary General of the time, Mr. Dema Diang, who was Special Advisor to Secretary General for Prevention of Genocide as well, has written to Government of India requesting for these Asia Pacific consultations in India. We were not flagging up any human rights issues. It was just a consultation process as part of our planning for the years ahead. We were given an assurance by the then foreign minister, who is no more, that she will facilitate the process. But it never happened. Twice we were betrayed, and the UN Under Secretary General then had to bring it to the attention of the permanent mission in New York that this is not something we would expect from the country which claims to be the world's largest democracy. I think I could have gone in rounds and circles, and since we have more panelists on, these are my reflections, and I hope the panelists and those who are listening will make good use of those. Thank you very much, and thank you all for it.
Thank you, Dr. Jima. It's always wonderful listening to you and your inputs, which are always reflective of the situation on ground. And you rightly pointed out we need to engage other oppressed people in our campaign regarding our rights. And you rightly also pointed out about the dossier which the government of Pakistan has prepared, and we had also the same concern as there was no mention of these special communications and many other things were missing in that dossier. It would have been more effective if those things would have been incorporated in this dossier. I will straight away go now to Canada, to dear friend Robert. Robert, you have the floor. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. I want to thank our two previous speakers, Mr. Jilani and Dr. Shima, for their remarks, which were very informative and very important to this discussion. There are a number of things I want to comment on, partly responding to some things they said or building on some things they said regarding expelling India from the UN, the possibility of pursuing that route. It would be an uphill battle, certainly, and very difficult to accomplish. But by even bringing that to the United Nations would cause some reputational damage to India, which is important to do. There are economic considerations that unfortunately would prevent it. The United States will support India because of trade. Other countries will do the same. But even the effort of doing it will shine a light on at least some of the many violations of human rights and international law that India is routinely committing. It would be necessary, that would be one of the things that could be done to draw the attention of various governments to the extreme violations of human rights that are currently ongoing and have been for generations, but have been made worse since the abrogation. But it will show other governments more clearly what's going on. There are, as was mentioned, many wider issues, many things going on in India now. I won't go into them in detail, but some of them were already mentioned: restrictions on social media, on women, farmers, and human rights defenders. These people are being killed or arrested. Their livelihoods are being taken from them. We know that in the remote parts of Kashmir, people who've lived for generations on homesteads are being expelled from their land. Their apple trees that they use to sustain their lives are being cut down by the thousands. And the violations of free press, freedom of speech, and so on are extreme. Human Rights Watch reported in 2020 that the government of India had created a new policy to report and root out what they call fake news, plagiarism, and any anti-national activities, and that the provisions are so broad that anything that in any way criticizes the government of India can be banned. And this includes the closing of press offices, as we've seen was addressed in one of the communications from the Special Rapporteur. It can mean the arrest, imprisonment, and killing of journalists, and so on. So these are ongoing and constant violations of the human rights of the people of Kashmir. Now, what we see by India ignoring or not responding to the letters, the official communiques from the Special Rapporteur and the Investigative Committee is India demonstrating itself as another rogue nation among other powerful nations in the world that refuse to recognize international law and refuse to abide by it. So there are a number of things that that other governments can do. Unfortunately, because of, as I mentioned before, economic considerations, mainly, many will not act to curb India from its violations of human rights and from committing these. But what we need to do then is organize people within various countries of the world. The governments won't act until the people force them to act, until they start to demonstrate in the streets, they start to vote out the leaders that will ignore human rights. We've seen it happen in the past, but it's such a grand scale, such a global scale. The people in Kashmir are suffering horrendously, and that is not being publicized to a great degree. As mentioned earlier, I'm also involved in Palestinian human rights efforts, and as horribly as they're suffering, at least there is more publicity. There's a growing awareness of the suffering of the Palestinians. This isn't happening with the people of Kashmir, or if it's happening, it's very small. It's not brought up in campaigns. It's not brought up in foreign policy platforms. Countries such as the United States government will say that Kashmir is an internal issue, internal to India. It is not. Countless and repeated United Nations resolutions have clearly said that that is not the case. UN Resolution 47, which states that the future of Kashmir and the Kashmir people will be decided upon an free and independent plebiscite, which has not been allowed, and there is no talk of it ever being permitted. This is something that the international community must demand. But unless the public knows what's happening in India, knows of the repression, knows of the violations of human rights, many of these violations are also violations of India's own constitution. But the current government and previous governments, but certainly the current government, which is very anti-Muslim, is determined to persecute Muslims anywhere in India, and we're seeing that repeatedly. Modi himself has a long record of anti-Muslim, brutal anti-Muslim actions and activities. These are things that are not being publicized, that are not being made, that people around the world are not being made aware of. Government leaders are probably aware of them, or may not be, probably don't care about them. But it is the people that will make the change, and it's the people that must make the change. The fact that India is ignoring the letters and communications from the special rapporteurs should be shocking to everybody. These are people, and these investigative committees have been created to address human rights abuses. They are doing so. They are contacting the government of India and other countries that they're assigned to, and pointing out these abuses and asking them, is this information accurate? If so, what's being done about it? If not, can you prove that it's not accurate? And the governments are simply not reacting or not responding, which in itself indicates that the accusations are true and that the governments don't care about them. So I don't want to take a lot of time this morning. There are several people to hear from this morning in where I am. There's several people to hear from. But what I'm seeing, just to summarize, the idea of petitioning to expel India from the United Nations is one that would have an impact reputationally against India, which is very important. Working at the grassroots in different countries in the world to bring awareness of the suffering of the Kashmiri people and other people, especially Muslims throughout India, is vitally important to do, because it is the people who will be able to make a difference in their own countries around the world. I can go to my representative. We've just had an election yesterday in Canada. In my own district, a very responsive individual has been elected. I can talk to that individual about him, and he can start to elevate things, escalate things to the federal government. This has to be done throughout the world to help the people of India and other suffering people, because the governments are interested in power and profits, not interested in human rights and international law. So we need to force them to take that interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Now I will go straight away to Julie Ward. Julie, you there? Julie?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for inviting me to speak. You know, in normal times, we'd all be together in Geneva and we'd be able to have very in-depth conversations with one another. And I mourn the fact that we can't do that. But I also want to thank you for your continuing engagement and the way that you reach out to me. I came into office in 2014 and I didn't know anything about the Kashmir struggle. But I represented a huge region in the northwest of England, which had still has a very large Kashmiri diaspora. And I made it my business, actually, as a member of the European Parliament, representing that region, to educate myself. And it's an ongoing task. So every time I'm invited to speak at one of your conferences, or we meet, or you send me documents to read, I learn more. And I've learned so much already just by listening to the previous speakers. So thanks also for their words and their incredible knowledge. I've been thinking about this issue of special rapporteurs and countries, governments, prime ministers deciding that the special rapporteurs, are speaking out of turn and not, and making comments without proper reference to the governments or the ministers. And I just want to say this is something that is happening increasingly across the world, particularly in large states where people think, where we've got right-wing authoritarian governments that just want to dispense with human rights and ride roughshod over human rights, and also in places where governments are changing the constitution and changing the laws in order to stifle opposition. And we even had a situation here in the UK where Philip Alston, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, made a fact-finding visit to the UK and wrote a damning report of what the British Conservative government had done by imposing austerity cuts. And his assessment was that this was ideological and had tragic consequences, because many people who had suffered under the public service cuts through the austerity measures were people with disabilities, were the most vulnerable people, actually. And the British government didn't like the criticism and refused to accept that Philip Alston, who is an expert, was giving a fair assessment. So let's put this in the context, that broader political context of, governments that are continuing really to find any means possible to crack down on opposition, minority views, protest, news and media that's fair and balanced, as opposed to just their own agenda. And I thought it was extraordinary how many special rapporteurs have visited India recently, and also reported obviously on the situation with Jammu and Kashmir. These are people who are experts in their own subjects. It's an extremely it's a task that requires a lot of focus and attention. And they're called special rapporteurs because they have this depth of knowledge, because they are given a very clear brief about what they are expected to research. And the fact that there have been so many of these different rapporteurs coming to India to look at various situations, and being extremely critical of the government, whether it's the issue of the effect of the abrogation of Article 370, or whether it's the evictions in Faridabad, or whether it's other issues, the IT issues as well that came up. There is a lot of scrutiny happening right now, a lot of scrutiny, a lot of on the ground research. And I am so glad that this is still happening, that the UN is still sending in these experts to be honest, to do that research and to be honest. And what we're discovering is, of course, that the true picture exposes Modi in the same way that it exposed the Conservative government here in the UK as basically not upholding human rights, a whole range of human rights being disrespected and being transgressed. I think one of the most important things is that we continue to show solidarity with all dispossessed people, with all people involved in self-determination struggles, with all minorities, because our quarrel is not a quarrel with the poorest people in India. Our quarrel is with the government, and in particular with the BJP and with Modi. And I think that seeing how he has failed his people through the COVID pandemic demonstrates really there's a total lack of concern to govern fairly for all people. And so that's going on, within India proper, and of course has been going on for a very long time with regard to the situation of Jammu and Kashmir. And let's continue to stand in solidarity with those people. I think it was Dr. Chima, was it, who said we have to recognize those common struggles, I think. And human rights was never given to anybody. We have to fight for it. And then when we have our human rights, we have to defend them. And we shouldn't think that we have them for life, forever. And when we see the human rights that people have fought for years and years and years being removed and transgressed, then we have to speak up, and we have to speak up at every possible occasion. Now, I understand about the frustration and the criticism that many people make about the UN. But I do think in the current administration, we have an absolutely fantastic Secretary General in Antonio Gutierrez, who is very brave. For example, his global compact on migration was an extremely important move. But again, lots of countries decided they were just going to do their own thing and they weren't going to sign up to it. But what happens then is that they're exposed. They're exposed as countries that are not aligned with these international human rights norms. So I think that we need to put some faith into put some of our faith into the UN and try and support the work that the UN is doing when it can, particularly with regard to the special rapporteurs. And I know that there is support right from the top, from Antonio Gutierrez to all these initiatives, which I think are really, really important. And I don't think they're going to stop. And so in a way, it was good to read about the many different special rapporteurs that had been visiting and making their reports. And of course, all of these reports have been dismissed and by India. So yeah, we need to be, I used to think this about the EU. Often people would describe it as a kind of a sort of entity somewhere over there that wasn't to do with people. And I always felt, well, I'm EU, it's mine. I'm a citizen. And because of that, I have to defend it. And I think we need to start to see the UN in that way, right? It doesn't belong to institutions; it belongs to the people, and it's the brotherhood, the comradeship, the solidarity between peoples, between nations, particularly standing up for oppressed people, that is really, really important. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Slightly. Always, you are spot on the point. You rightly pointed out, we need for unity among the groups who are striving for the right to self-determination. As one in case is Jammu and Kashmir, and we, the people of Kashmir, have been supporting all the causes around the globe. But unfortunately, we don't see a solidarity from the groups around the globe for our cause in that way. They don't reciprocate in the same way. We have been doing it for the Palestine over the past, I think, more than for our struggle, we did it for the Palestine. And we hope that people around the globe will support our cause, and we will continue to knock at the doors of the people, their conscience, and also the UN. And we are thankful to the UN Special Rapporteurs for their efforts, what they have been doing. We must pay the tribute to the late Christoph Hans, who was the first to provide a very strong report on the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and especially the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which was prevailing in Kashmir. And he rightly pointed out that it overrides the right to life. But what he faced from India, that's also history. And the same way, Margaret Sakakaya also had a very wonderful report on the situation of human rights defenders in Kashmir. And lately now, essentially the special rapporteurs like Laura Fisher and others are doing a wonderful job for in bringing up the issues of human rights in Kashmir. I will straight away now go to Barrister Tanveer Munib. Tanveer, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Altaf Hussain Wani, for giving me this opportunity to speak about a very pressing matter, which is the special rapporteurs' communications and the non-responsiveness of the states. So, and I'm also giving thanks and good afternoon to all the eloquent speakers of this webinar. So before I basically start my talk from the perspective of law, I'll try to expound something on the system of special rapporteurs. Special rapporteurs are basically a special mechanism under the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, as we all know. And the special rapporteurs are unpaid, and they are the experts on their own topic, on the topic on which they're basically doing their rapporteur job. And the special rapporteurs are basically, they act as eyes and ears of the Human Rights Council, and their mandates emanated from the United Nations basically to report, to examine, and to publicly report the human rights situation of a particular country or a particular theme. And they do it by writing and issuing communications, and then visiting a particular country, and then making report to the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly. Now, why we are seeing so less of a response from some particular states, we have to look into the weakness of the system of special rapporteurs. So the first weakness, as far as I've found it, is basically the no follow-up procedure after the communications and reports are made, and then empty political commitments made by the states and governments in questions rather than implementing the recommendations. Another weakness is non-cooperation from international community as well as the states in question. And another weakness, the last weakness I would rather say, that no enforcement mechanism is in place to enforce the recommendations of the special rapporteurs. On this particular point of non-cooperation of international community, I'd like to draw the attention to the special rapporteur on former Yugoslavia in 1991, Mr. Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who was the former Prime Minister of Poland. He resigned from his job as special rapporteur because he didn't get that much support when the human rights violation was exacerbating and he was drawing attention to the international community. And same thing happened for Mr. Yash Gai, who was also the special rapporteur for Cambodia. And he even criticized the UN system for not protecting the integrity of his office when the Cambodian rulers were attacking his office verbally. So these are the weaknesses of the system of special rapporteurs. Now let's come to the solution. So what can be done in order to address this particular weakness? To me as a lawyer, I would say that since the special rapporteurs, their reports and recommendations are basically part of international human rights law, which is a part of public international law. And as far as public international law is concerned, the enforcement of public international law is basically based on persuasion, cajoling, and reasoned argument. So there is no exception to it. I think this should be the first thing that the special rapporteurs they should do. And then, the Human Rights Council, which is the governing body of this particular special rapporteur, they are unchanged, meaning none of the members, the 47 members of the Human Rights Council, none of them has the veto power. So they should make the most use of it. And then the Human Rights Council, member states of them, the member states of the Human Rights Council, the 47 members, according to the General Assembly Resolution 161, the United Nations General Assembly categorically said that the member states, they have the duty to uphold and protect the rights of the human rights all around the globe. And it is pertinent to mention here that India is a member of the Human Rights Council. So they have the utmost duty to protect the human rights of the Kashmiris. And then comes, as we have seen previously, that the special rapporteurs, they basically briefed the Security Council. Like we saw in 1990, the special rapporteur on violence against women, Ms. Radhika Kumaraswamy, she basically briefed the United Nations Security Council on the situation of women in Sierra Leone. So I think if the United Nations makes it a General Assembly, makes it a very usual procedure for the special rapporteurs to brief the Security Council on Kashmir issue or any other issues, I believe that might draw much response from the states in question. So apart from it, we have the NGOs like AIR and other activists and advocates, those who are basically having the observer status as well as the consultative status with the United Nations. So during the Human Rights Council session, which is forthcoming, I believe, and also the complaint procedure and the universal periodic review of the Human Rights Council, these NGOs, they can actually support the special rapporteurs report and also make reference to their shadow reports to the United Nations, core human rights bodies and other mechanisms. And so apart from that, so these are the basic solutions. To me, I think that, in order to draw the weaknesses of the special rapporteurs, these are steps can be taken. Now let's go to the special rapporteurs report themselves. Like the first report, to my knowledge, was basically on 19 August 2019. It was made by the special rapporteur to the Indian government, where they categorically addressed the violation of the right to freedom of expression and the freedom of right to peaceful assembly. Then again on February 27 on 2020, the second communication was made to the Indian government on the massive crackdown on those who are showing their dissent to the central government. And then again, 4 special rapporteurs on 5 May 2020. Now, one is basically a special rapporteur on inhuman and degrading treatment. The other one is a special rapporteur on arbitrary killings and extrajudicial killings. And then a special rapporteur on minority issues, a special rapporteur on religion and belief. 4 of them made a joint statement and communication to the Indian government telling that there is a deteriorating continuous situation of violation of serious violation of human rights. And they basically mentioned arbitrary detention and tortures, ill treatment and inhuman treatment of the Kashmiri subjects. Then the United Nations asked the Indian government to basically start prosecution of those who are the perpetrators of the violations of the human rights under Article 6 of the ICCPR, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, which protects which basically tells us the right to life of an individual, and then also under Article 7, which is of the Convention Against Torture, which tells us that there should be prosecution for those who tortures, and then also any impartial investigation under Article 12 of the Convention Against Torture. So the UN categorically said this, to the Indian government to start prosecuting those who are the perpetrators. But unfortunately, we saw no response from the Indian government. Then again, this year on 31st March, the United Nations special rapporteurs, this time 5 special rapporteurs, they basically communicated to the Indian government, telling that they have found a systematic pattern of violation of human rights. So we have found a very common thread in the reports of the special rapporteurs. First, we have seen that they have said that the violation of right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, then massive crackdown, then unlawful detention and ill treatment and inhuman treatment and torture, and then a systematic, pattern of violation for human rights. But yet we have seen no response from the Indian government. Now, what can be done? I mean, what is the state responsibility for the violation of human rights or to comply with the reports of the special rapporteurs? What are the state's responsibility? As I've just said, a few minutes before, that the United Nations Resolution 60/251, it says that the member states of the Human Rights Council, they have the utmost duty to protect and promote human rights. And it is, because of this resolution, it has become a part of the international human rights law as well as public international law. And India, being a member of the Human Rights Council, they have to be they are the first state that should step in to protect the rights of the Kashmiri subjects, let alone, no question of violating it. And then the next responsibility emanates from a doctrine known as just cogence. So the international jurists, most of them agreed that some rights are basically peremptory, that no derogation is permitted to, that no derogations are permitted. So the protection of human rights is a peremptory norm and as well as a just cogence. And if there's a violation of a just cogence, then obligatio erga omnes, which is another legal phrase, which means obligation towards everyone, it is attracted. So if there's a violation of human rights, then it is an obligation for all the states around the globe to intervene, to interfere, and to take action. So likewise, India being a member state of the Human Rights Council, and other, from the perspective of public international law, they should be the first state that should step in, and all the states around the globe should equally step into the matter because it is a violation of a peremptory norm. Now, India can say that these are simply wrongful acts, not just cogence. If they say so, then fine. There is ample law in the public international law that says that if India wants to defend their wrongful acts by way of defenses such as self-defense or force majeure, as we often hear from the authorities of Indian government, then these particular defenses are not that much tenable in international law. And apart from it, there is a draft article adopted by the International Law Commission in 2001, responsibility of states for wrongful acts in Article 4, paragraph 1 of that draft article. It's been frequently cited by the International Court of Justice. It's an authority. So it categorically says that a state has to, liabilities should be attributed to the states for the atrocities and the deeds committed by their organs, be they judicial or executive or legislature and whatever, in provincial or in territorial government. So the state, the central government should be responsible. So, and the Human Rights Committee also said in its jurisprudence, in its interpretation of the ICCPR, the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, it is stated that India can claim, for example, that we are actually trying the perpetrators domestically, as we have also heard this sort of things coming from them. But the Human Rights Committee said, while interpreting the ICCPR, that if the domestic remedy is ineffective and not available, then the exhaustion of the domestic remedy is not necessary. So the international forums like ICJ or other forums can be approached directly. So if that is the case, obviously, then and as we all know, I'm not sure how effective or how available the domestic remedies there for the Kashmiri subjects. I'm not sure about it. So now, if we proceed to the question of interstate, actions that can be taken against the perpetrators, or in this case, India, then the best forum to take interstate action is the International Court of Justice, because under Article 36(1) and under Article 36, paragraph 2 of the ICJ statute, if there is a violation of just cogence, if there is a violation of peremptory norm, then any state can take action, like we have seen in case of Myanmar, right? Gambia is not directly affected by what Myanmar did, but it basically took Myanmar to the International Court of Justice. So if any state is interested, because there's an obligation erga omnes on it, then it can attract the paragraph, Article 36(1) of ICJ, bring India before the International Court of Justice. And if an individual wants to lodge a complaint, then obviously ICC should have been the best forum, but unfortunately neither India nor Pakistan or China are members of the Roma Statute, which is the governing statute of the International Criminal Court. And finally, I would like to end my talk by stating that mere rhetorical assertions, to me, I would say, that will not draw that much attention from that much response from the states in question, or in our case, India. I would say that if claimed as legal entitlements, then the maximum response can be expected from the state in question. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanveer. You brought a host of international laws and also resolutions of the General Assembly, and also the reports of the Human Rights Committee's resolutions and all that, what can be done in future. As far as the local remedy is concerned, I don't have the information, whatever the local remedy. So as far as local remedy is concerned, there is no such avenue available for the people of Kashmir as local remedy. As we have seen, we have, as Puran Poshpura rape case, one of the famous rape cases, that case was from this lower court to the Supreme Court of India. And then again, the impunity was that it was referred. It was never attended first by the forces, Fourth Rajputana Rifles. They never attended the court, and thus this was defeated. There was no decision on that till date. And likewise, we have seen in one of the famous cases of fake encounters which took place in 1995, it was 36 Pora, when President Bill Clinton was visiting Kashmir, and some 36 were killed. And then the other day, the Indian forces killed 5 persons and asked that these were the foreign terrorists. And then when hue and cry was there, and then it was found that those were the local people, local Bagrawals. And then CBI, India's own CBI, found the 4 of the army officers involved in that fake encounter. But again, it was the military tribunal, we then let them go. And none of the perpetrators till date has been brought to justice. But some things like Dr. Nazir Gilani was telling us earlier, that his father, his uncle, and others who were arrested, then special rapporteurs issued and communicated to the government of India, and they got released. And likewise, we saw when the human rights defenders like Parvez and others, they were detained, and because of the intervention of the special procedures, they got released. And these things did happen, but there is no local, as such, local recourse to the people of Kashmir available. That's why we are sending the cases to the human rights special procedures, to the advisory committee and others. And we see the reflections of these cases in their communication, in their reports, and we hope someday there will be some shame on the government of India or the governments around. We talked about the UPR. We have witnessed the 3 cycles of UPR so far. And 3 of the UPRs, we have seen so many recommendations from the non-governmental organizations on India to improve its human rights record. There were 172 recommendations to the government of India to improve its human rights record. And the government of India, in their response, that they will abide by, but none of them was fulfilled till date, as one of them was to repeal the Armed Forces Special Power Act, was to take away the Public Safety Act, and then it was about these these fake encounters taking in place, and also about women's rights in India and Kashmir, and also ratifying the Convention on Enforced Disappearances and Convention on Torture. But every time Government of India said it's the Parliament of India, we are going to ratify it, but they did not ratify it till date. So these are the situations available to us. I will go straight away to United States. Mary truly is waiting there for a long time. Mary, you have the floor.
Yes, hello. Thank you for asking me here. My specialty is not diplomacy or law or the legal questions, because I am one of those people who tends to see the United Nations as part of the problem and less as part of the solution. My orientation is more towards the grassroots, towards building a social movement in solidarity with the Kashmiri struggle against colonialism. And one of the reasons, I'm a latecomer to this. I haven't been studying or writing about Kashmir up until about 2015. I thought it was the state of India until that time, and I didn't know anything about its freedom struggle. And it's because one of the main things that India employs against the Kashmiri struggle is the news blackout. I don't think that most of us, there was news in Kashmir, about Kashmir in the media, but it was very disconnected and disjointed. You would have to actually go to the library and go through the very limited scholarship in order to understand anything about Kashmir, at least if you lived in the United States. You would not be able to understand it for decades from media reports, including in the New York Times. And I think that it was the activity of Kashmiri activists, along with their Pakistani allies, who broke that media blackout through a very pioneering use of social media. And it was in that period of time of less than 10 years when people like me were introduced to the Kashmiri freedom struggle, and in particular to the human rights violations going on, not just the overwhelming occupation and militarization of Kashmir, but to the massacres, to the mass rapes as a weapon of war, to the unbelievable use of pellet guns against unarmed protesters, to the use of these sieges on residential neighborhoods where they razed the neighborhood, torched the homes, vandalized the homes, assault protesters, kill protesters. That was all introduced to us by Kashmiri activists who took such an effective use of the internet and social media during that time. And that's when most of us became very aware of the human rights movement in Kashmir, of the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Societies, Khurram Parvez, and the work that whole organization did on the Association of Parents for Parents of Disappeared People in Parvina Hangar. That's when we became aware of these people and the reports that they issued. Those were invaluable reports that they issued. I was educated by them. And now India, being aware of how effective the news blackout was in terms of building support around the world, then reimposed it in a draconian way in 2019, on August 5th, 2019, where we heard nothing in and out of India for months, for 6, 7, 8 months. And now, in the last year, they began once again seeing that Kashmiri activists will use every opening that they can find. They once again have begun to impose a draconian blackout so that there is, they crushed the presence of Kashmiris on social media by, first of all, getting Facebook and Twitter to collaborate with them by shutting them out and deleting them. Secondly, by calling these activists in for interrogation, detaining them, intimidating and terrorizing them off of social media. Even if they liked posts or commented on posts, that was all being surveilled and documented. And then lastly, of course, is by this extreme repression of journalism and journalists, where they don't allow journalists to even attend these military operations, to report on them or take photos of them, where they assault journalists, where they call them in for interrogation, where they detain them. So some of them still detained after a couple of years. So I think that the blackout, the news blackouts, are one of India's most effective ways of shutting down any possibility that people like me will continue to become informed and educated and active around the issue of Kashmir. And of course, what they want blacked out is the question of these pellet guns. The issue alone, of human rights, the issue alone of pellet guns is enough to ignite and inspire solidarity around the world, because it is so gruesome that you would take a weapon of buckshot, which is outlawed in the state of Texas, where I live, one of the most backward states probably in the world, that it would outlaw it here for the use against animals and birds, but India would use it routinely against young people, against elderly, against children, against protesters in Kashmir. It's unspeakable. And yet this is all shut down. I think that we have to get around that news blackout, because that's going to prevail. And there isn't much we can do except try to build a movement in spite of it. We have plenty of historical information to draw on to educate about the struggle in Kashmir. We have plenty of information, but it isn't sufficient. And I think what we have to do is begin to employ what the Vietnam, I'm an old anti-war Palestinian activist for almost 60 years now. We have to employ the kinds of strategies that those movements did. And one of them is teach-ins. We need to have teach-ins and panels and forums on the campuses where we're most likely to attract activists. We have to figure out ways. There are lots of Kashmiris in diaspora who are teachers and professors on campuses. We need to make inroads into those campuses and set up teach-ins, set up panels, get speakers on tours, speakers who are not afraid for their families in Kashmir. And we need to make that a strategy or a tactic, whatever it is. We need to make that, employ that, because we need to find ways to overcome the news blackout. We cannot let India dictate whether or not we can build a social movement in defense of things. And the other thing that I think is really important is that if you look at Palestinian solidarity, if you look at the solidarity with the Rohingya or with the Uyghur or any other of these liberation struggles, what you see is that there will be a massive upsurge around a particularly heinous event, so that in 2014, when Israel was scorched earth bombing Gaza for 7 weeks, there were over 1 million people around the world that protested. There have been almost no protests since, a little bit earlier this year, but there have been no protests. Meanwhile, the genocide of the Palestinians is closer and closer, the final solution. The Rohingya, there was a major upheaval around the world, mostly Muslim allies, around the 2017 genocidal siege. But there's been very little since, except the Black for Rohingya on social media. In terms of Kashmir, there were major demonstrations around the world in 2019, all over the world. Hundreds of thousands of people to only a handful of people in some places, but they were all over the world, and there hasn't been really anything since, except the event that we organized on August 5th, which was a social media event, the Red for Kashmir event. So our thinking is that we cannot, in a time of genocide, where all these people are facing that, we can no longer rely on spontaneity, on spontaneous upsurges of support. We have to build a consistent, orchestrated, democratic, international movement that coordinates activities on social media and in public rallies and speak outs and all sorts of events. Emergency rallies when India pulls some particularly nasty thing. We have to have a coordinated campaign that is consistent and annual, that can call things spontaneously, that can have events on the internet, everything. We have to have a full movement that can do that. And so I think that the thinking of many Kashmiris in diaspora and people like allies like myself, Kashmiris, activists themselves in Kashmir and in Azad Kashmir, what we want is to build a movement that can collaborate with the Palestinian movement, with the Uyghur, with the Rohingya, that is a cohesive movement, because all of these struggles are facing genocide, and all of these struggles are anti-colonial struggles with many things in common. People often think that the Palestinian struggle is in a very strong position. I think if you look at the protests around the capture of the 6 young men who escaped from Gilboa, you'll see that it's actually fairly weak. There should be massive protests in defense of Palestinian political prisoners. So trying to coordinate these movements because of their affinities would not weaken any of these movements, but would strengthen all of them and be able to draw in bigger forces for all of them. So that's our perspective. One of the things I think, I just have a couple more comments. Well, one of the things I think that's a problem is that the New York Times and the Guardian and all of these major media, the Washington Post, they have the resources to do coverage on Kashmir, despite the news blackout. They have the resources to do that. They have the ability to do coverage that the Kashmir Walla or the Kashmiriyat does not, because its reporters and its editors are under scrutiny and surveillance and subject to arrest. And the reason that they're not doing it, I think, is political. I think my own assessment is that they were forced to do some very good coverage about pellet weapons and about the lockdown in 2019. They were forced to because they needed to get ahead of the narrative that Kashmiri activists had taught us on social media during the hiatus of their work on social media. They needed to get ahead of the freedom struggle, anti-colonial movement narrative and reduce it to more of a legalistic kind of thing. And so if you notice, there has been very little reporting. There has been some in the New York Times and other media, but there's been very little reporting compared to the scale of the problem. And I think, without being a conspiracy theorist, that it has very much to do with the associations, the military contracts and associations that the United States has with India, very important to India in South Asia. The military commercial contracts that India has with Europe, with other countries in South Asia, with countries like New Zealand and Australia, and Japan. It has substantial commercial and military and trade agreements with those countries. And so they, looking to them to stand up to the Kashmiris is kind of a fool's errand, because they have too much at stake in terms of profit and militarism to ever stand with the Kashmiris against India. And I think that the second problem is a complete lack of a substantial anti-colonial movement in India, a very shameful thing, because liberals, Indian liberals and socialists, for the most part, support the occupation as a seditious thing. I mean, support as an anti-sedition thing. And so I think that building a movement will help to, first of all, expose our own government's involvement in collusion with India in the occupation, not just Israel's collusion by selling weapons or exchanging special forces training and stuff, but all of our government's involvement with the occupation, with the sustaining the occupation. And these teach-ins and forums and panels would help to expose that. And secondly, it would put pressure on the Indian radicals and liberals to actually take a look at the question of Kashmir and see it as an anti-colonial struggle, instead of this narrow provincial colonial mentality that they have towards it. So that's really all I have to say about it. I hope that all of us will be able to work together. I've taken names to build a movement, because I think nothing is more important than educating people around the world about the struggle of the Kashmiri people for freedom, which is an inspiration. I believe it is one of the most important anti-colonial struggles in the world today. And it must be supported and it must be defended, because I believe that they are the vanguard in terms of human liberation. If the Kashmiris are triumphant over Indian colonialism, there are people around the world, the dispossessed around the world, who will be heartened to take up the struggle themselves and to also win the struggle against colonialism. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mary. You brought very important points and very much close to our hearts, and what we should do. As you asked about the use of social media and create awareness, and you refer to the two of the main organizations in Indian occupied Kashmir, JKCCS and APDP, and you know that from August 2020, their offices were confiscated. They are not allowed to work, and we could not see their reports anymore. And they have silenced each and every, just thanks to Almighty, me, Gilani, Pervez, and others. We are outside there, and we still do have something to say. Otherwise, there is no voice can come out of Kashmir, neither on the social media nor on any of the medias. Instead, Indian media is propagating some always demonizing Kashmiri freedom struggle and Kashmiris, and showing the world a different view of Kashmir. So thank you very much. Now I'll straight away go to Pervez Ahmed Shah. He has waiting for a long time. So Pervez, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Anisab. Thank you, KIR, for inviting me to this important webinar. And thank you very much for inviting learned panel, like say Dr. Nazir Gilani, Julie Watt, Iqtidar Chima, Barrister Tanveer, Robert Fantis, Mary, and Shugufta Ashraf. I'm much delighted to see Dr. Nazir Gilani in this event because Dr. Nazir Gilani is well versed with the situation of Jammu and Kashmir and has understanding of United Nations mechanisms, as well as fully understands the human rights jurisprudence. He has been writing since his adolescence, and I have been reading his write-ups. As Dr. Gilani has referred, Article 2, which is binding on the nations who are part of the UN or who are the members of the United Nations, that they have to follow the directions from the United Nations in letter and spirit. However, the India, which claims to be the largest democracy of the world and has been selling this mixture of democracy for the last 5 or 6 decades, has always shown its utter disregard to its commitments, to its promises, and all international agreements. If we see, when India occupied Jammu and Kashmir forcefully and people of Jammu and Kashmir resisted, it was India which took the matter to the United Nations, and United Nations passed the resolutions. And how effective these resolutions were, Dr. Gilani has written in depth. If we all of us will go through these writings, the case will be more clear, and there will be no doubt about the people's right to self-determination. But India backtracked from these resolutions and installed the regimes in Indian occupied Kashmir to negate the people's right to self-determination, but the people of Jammu and Kashmir continued their struggle peacefully. And we have seen in 1987, even the people of Jammu and Kashmir, the leadership of Jammu and Kashmir, especially those who are leading present freedom movement, as late Sayyid Ali Gilani, Sayyid Salahuddin, Yasin Malik, and others, even they contested the election of 1987 under the banner of Muslim United Front, to give peace a chance and to decide the future of Jammu and Kashmir inside the Legislative Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir. But India rigged all these elections and they were put behind the bars. And ultimately in 1998, the people of Jammu and Kashmir were forced to start a strong resistance movement against the Indian occupation. As the people of Jammu and Kashmir started resistance movement, Government of India declared state of Jammu and Kashmir Disturbed Area Act and applied a number of laws, draconian laws, which are still applicable in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. But people of Jammu and Kashmir have been struggling tirelessly for their people, for their right to self-determination. We have seen that the civil society, as well as the people, especially your institute, Dr. Gilani, and few of our friends, work day in, day out, and they succeeded in bringing the two important reports from the High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2018 and 2019, which acknowledged that how India is behaving in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir and how it is committing its human rights in Jammu and Kashmir. But unfortunately, despite these reports, we failed to get the Commission of Inquiry, or we didn't succeed to get the Commission of Inquiry formulated from United Nations, and at the same time, the fact-finding mission couldn't be sent to Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, although Pakistan had given the permission to visit, but India has not only but even maligned the High Commissioner, stated that it's all concocted, false, and is not based on the facts in Jammu and Kashmir, although this was all done by remote monitoring. Secondly, after these two reports, these reports, although it created a political optic, and it was established beyond any shadow of doubt that India is the perpetrator and is committing human rights violations, but on ground, it didn't make any difference. We have seen India was asked to stop excessive use of force, release the detainees. Even in 2019 report, India and Pakistan were asked to respect people's right to self-determination. But we have seen that despite these reports, India didn't respect the UN recommendation, but on 5th of August, it made a constitutional onslaught in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And unfortunately, the Jammu and Kashmir lost its status or special status as well as the special status, and the leadership was put behind the bars. After that, we have seen that there have been multiple recommendations or communications from the special rapporteurs, and as David Kay, it was the first rapporteur who wrote to the state that the Indian government that freedom of speech and expression should be restored in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, but we have seen nothing, no change has taken place on the ground. And we have witnessed that the journalists, dozens of journalists have been put behind the bars, and even we couldn't get any news from Indian occupied Kashmir for a couple of months. Rather, I can say that news was smuggled from Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir by those journalists to whom I pay tribute. As far as these special rapporteurs, although Dr. Gilani has much understanding and get his relatives released from Indian jails, and it was his tireless efforts, and it was, I can say, they were lucky enough, and otherwise we have seen, although most of the people, I can say really that sometimes these communications by the special rapporteurs work as a deterrent, but it is not the case always. When we talk of these communication which have been made by special rapporteurs, we have seen the last communication which was made to Government of India about that was Sahrai, Muhammad Ashraf Sahrai, who was killed extrajudicially, and rather I can say he was killed inside the prison, and he was in the prison for raising the voice of people of Jammu and Kashmir under Public Safety Act. But we have seen that the Government of India was asked to start an inquiry. But what India did, instead of starting an inquiry, India put his two sons behind the bars for the sin they have been accompanying to their father for his burial, and they have not yet been released. And secondly, when we are talking after that, we have seen the iconic leader of Jammu and Kashmir, that is Sayyid Ali Gilani, and how he was dealt by India, that he was kept in house arrest for 11 years, which I can say accelerated his death, because we know he was not feeling well. He has a lot of ailments, and unfortunately, after his death, rather I can say his martyrdom, his family was not even allowed to accompany him for the burial. And you can understand how much Sayyid Ali Gilani has the footprints among the people of Jammu and Kashmir, how much influential he has been in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. I will give you the example that for the last 72 years, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, I'm talking of occupied Jammu and Kashmir, that we had two towering leaders. One was Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, and second was Sayyid Gilani, and both of them died, and both the graves of both the leaders are guarded by Indian forces. But Sheikhullah is being guarded because people have a venom, and what Sheikhullah did with the freedom movement of Jammu and Kashmir, I guess if people will be allowed, they will dig his grave. But at the same time, Sayyid Ali Gilani's grave is guarded by Indian occupation forces because they know people are waiting that when they will get the access to pay tribute to this great leader. And you can just understand that how India is behaving with the leadership of me to this time is that India has adopted a two-pronged strategy in Jammu and Kashmir. On one hand, it is killing the people of Jammu and Kashmir. As I have once read, Dr. Gilani has written that death of a person is a death of right. He can exercise his right. On the other hand, it is changing the demographic composition of the Jammu and Kashmir, and those non-state subjects from India are being encouraged and they are allowed to purchase the land in Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir, rather Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and which is going ultimately to change the demographic composition. As all of you know that Geneva Convention has brought the occupation authorities to change the demography of, because definitely if you change the demography, it will affect the people's right to self-determination. Finally, what I would like to say that I will conclude that Mr. Gilani has, because I'm referring Gilani Saab again, because a wonderful article has been referred, that is Article 6, as Dr. Gilani has said that we have to work, and we have to make case against the India, because the only choice for the people of Jammu and Kashmir is to activate the UN mechanisms. Because as you were just talking, Wani Saab, that there is no remedy available to the people of Jammu and Kashmir in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, because we have seen the courts are biased and they do not give the judgments according to the law. Although in the statute books, the people of Jammu and Kashmir have every right, they can challenge the human rights violation in Indian courts, but first of all, the Indian courts do not give any kind of relief. If we take the case of these half widows, we have seen that in case of half widows who are waiting for their loved ones, husbands who have disappeared, that Indian court asked the state government to go for the DNA. At least these ladies can remarry, or they can inherit the property from which has been left by their husbands if they are dead, and the children of these disappeared persons have to face a lot of difficulties in getting the admissions in the schools. So I want to say that the only remedy we have that is available with the UN mechanism. For this, we have to pool our energies, as we have all this learned panel and the people who are outside this panel who are working in diaspora, they have to sit together and they have to pool their energies so that we can create some obstacles for India, because you know that India is on one hand committing the human rights violations in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, but on the other hand, it is just talking about the reforms in United Nations and is demanding the seat in the Security Council. And you see how Indian behavior, how India is behaving. And I endorse it that Article 6, as referred by Gilani, should be activated, and other all means, I can say lawfare, should be activated. If we have the options available within the UN mechanism, we should activate all these mechanisms. Otherwise, there is no remedy available in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and we cannot wait for a long time because people are being cared. And secondly, we should all work because India is creating an impression internationally that it is a leaderless movement because after Gilani Saab's death, a vacuum has been created. But I can say with authority, it is not leaderless, but a vacuum has surely been created because all the political leaders, just Muhammad Khan, Masarat Alam, Shabir Ahmad Shah, Yasin Malik, they are all in detention. Once they are released, India is afraid that they may come out and lead this freedom struggle because India thinks that there is everything is peaceful in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. But I can say there is silence, but it is a silence of a graveyard, and people have the sentiment. People do not want to live with India because what India has done to Kashmiris, people will not forget it for the ages. So I will not take, because it has been a long session. At the end, I'm just going to thank all the panelists who have made wonderful contributions in this webinar. And I hope they will continue their struggle and they will continue and put their efforts to mitigate the miseries of people of Jammu and Kashmir. I thank you all.
Thank you, Syed Parvez Shah, for your contribution. So we are coming to the end of the webinar. I would like to say Dr. Nazir Gilani Sahab, Munib, and Robert to say some final words, 2 minutes each. Dr. Gilani.
Thank you very much. I think it was inspirational to hear the cluster of scholars, and I would like to thank Parvez Ahmad Shah as well for his very kind words and deep insight. My submission would be that we have to quantify our efforts. And as Parvez Shah Sahab has rightly said, that you have no exit except to activate the UN template on Kashmir. You would be misdirecting yourselves, you would be going adrift, and you would not be of any service to the cause of Kashmir if you drift away from UN template on Kashmir. And yes, I agree, invoking Article 6 might be difficult, but there's nothing difficult in this world. In one's, if United Nations can investigate United States of America, Great Britain, Israel, they can investigate India. So we have to build up pressure and work towards informing the United Nations that how long would you allow India a non-compliance of this kind. I think I would reinforce my request, reiterate that there is a need to consider Article 6 because India has a higher burden of responsibility in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, in the Human Rights Council, and in the neighborhood. Thank you. And I would say that it was a wonderful effort by you. And always I enjoyed your smile. You didn't get tired, although we did tax your patience through and through. But it was a wonderful interaction, and the people around the world from Canada, from America, from Bangladesh, and our wonderful friend from Islamabad, Parvez Shah Sahab. It has been a reconnect, and I appreciate it and I enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Mr. Wani.
Thank you, Dr. Gilani. Robert, your last comments. You are mute. You are mute.
I want to thank everybody for their participation. I learned a lot. I was, as Mr. Gilani said, inspired by what's been said, motivated to do more for Kashmir than I have done in the past. There were many excellent points brought up. There was some good conversation about the role of the United Nations. One of the main problems that was addressed about the weakness of the special rapporteur is that there's no enforcement mechanism, which is an unfortunate thing. And if that could be changed, that would be good. But as other people mentioned, we need to work with the structure that we have now and work within that structure. I also believe, as Ms. Scully said, that organizing people teaching people and publicizing the facts of the repression in Kashmir and the horrific things that are happening, the sexual abuse, the killing of men, women, and children. This has to become much more public, and it is our role to see that it does so. So again, I thank the organizers. I thank the organization, Kashmir Institute of International Relations, for this very useful panel. I hope that there are more and that the people of Kashmir will soon be free.
Thank you, Robert. Looking forward to your book and seeing myself in that. So, Tanveer, your last words.
Thank you very much, Altaf, for giving me this opportunity to speak today. I've learned a lot from the eloquent speakers, joining from different parts of the globe. So my last words would be, I'll be hoping that as the next stage of this special rapporteurs procedure, the Human Rights Council will basically start its HRC mandated investigations into the situation, like we have seen the fact-finding mission in Myanmar, in Syria, in Yemen, in Venezuela, or the inquiry commission and things like that. So I believe that if these, HRC mandated investigations are undertaken, then there will be a great response we can expect from the Indian government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanveer. Mary, your last words.
Yes, I agree that we cannot be dismissive of the United Nations. I think that they are part of the problem, but I also believe that getting the UN to enforce the referendum on Kashmir would be an optimal thing. I just think that the United Nations would be much more likely to do that if we put pressure on our individual countries to do the right thing regarding Kashmir and India, and to denounce India for its conduct in Kashmir and for the occupation. So yes, I do not dismiss the United Nations at all. I think it's very important. So thank you for straightening me out.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you all panelists for a wonderful contributions. It's true that along with United Nations tablet, we have to create the awareness in the different parts of the world, in the civil society, in the think tanks, and in the political circles, and to create a mass support for the people of Kashmir. With all this, I thank you all, and inshallah, see you next time in the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.